Now, detonate the reality bomb!
I will build a great, great wall.
Some alien race to come down and threaten us.
Is the singularity near?
The truth is out there.
The military-industrial complex.
The seven mountains of the influencers of culture.
To be as gods, you know.
Change has come to America.
Catapult of propaganda.
From a secure location on top of the ridge in the heart of the beautiful Missouri Ozarks, this is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
The sun sets slowly in the west over the ridge. A breeze wafts in through the windows, and that means once again the pollen count is about 1 zillion. No, it's time for A View from the Bunker. And this week, well, we got a number of things to talk about that are kind of dark, actually. The San Diego synagogue shooting, Sri Lanka, and the left's refusal to call Christians Christians. Riots in Gaza and Hamas embracing cryptocurrency to raise money. And the Mueller report nails a Clinton. Bill Clinton, that is. Oh, yes, and we'll talk about the U.S. military's plans to kill Godzilla. Our guest this week in the interview segment, he rides because they died. Tony Price, Executive Director of the Gold Star Ride Foundation, joins us tonight. This is A View from the Bunker for Sunday, April 28th, 2019. I'm Derek Gilbert, and thank you for joining us tonight. However and wherever you're listening, whether it's at Spreaker.com, iHeartRadio, Stitcher.com, Spotify.com, or at the website, vftb.net. The chat room is open if you're listening at Spreaker.com. Our in-studio audience, Sam T. Dachshund, is underneath his binky and ready for a fun-filled evening and hopefully information-packed evening. We got some stuff to talk about that's fun, others that's not quite so much fun. Dark, and some things we'll talk about that I hope will be inspirational. So all that ahead over the next couple of hours. If you're listening in the archives, we appreciate that because we understand that we're all busy, and so making an appointment here every Sunday night at 7 p.m. Central Time, which is UTC -5 now that we're on daylight savings, is not always easy to do. But we know that there are people listening around the world. We thank you to Edmund and his family in Malaysia, friends in Australia, South Africa, the UK. We appreciate you downloading and listening, however it is. Of course, the easy way to do it and make sure you record or get all of these programs, rather, is by subscribing to the podcast. You can do that at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Stitcher.com, iHeartRadio, Spotify. Of course, we've got links to all of those at vftb.net, the website, which is our global hub for A View from the Bunker. The easiest of the easy ways, of course, is just download the free mobile app. If you've got an iOS device, whether it's an iPad, iPod Touch, iPhone, or some sort of Android device, you can download the free mobile app, and these programs will come right to your smartphone or tablet. The website, as I mentioned, vftb.net. Our YouTube channel, we send all of these to YouTube as well. Audio only for the time being, anyway. YouTube.com/Derek Gilbert. That's D-E-R-E-K. That's the YouTube channel. And on social media, you'll find us at Facebook, Facebook.com/ViewFromTheBunker. Twitter, as long as they'll have us, at ViewFromBunker or at Derek Gilbert. Either one. And you'll find us also at the new social media site, by Christians and for Christians, oneway.com. Great interface. It's actually very easy. It's sort of like the best of Facebook and the best of Twitter, but no ads, and you don't get shadow banned for expressing openly Christian opinions. So oneway.com, you'll find me there under the username Derek P. Gilbert. Another evil man took it upon himself to decide who should live and who should die. This happened Saturday in a suburb north of San Diego, where police say a 19-year-old man walked into a Chabad synagogue, that's a branch of Hasidic Judaism, and opened fire. 4 people were shot. 1 woman, a 60-year-old woman, died. The rabbi lost 2 fingers as he wrestled with the gunman. Gunman opened fire, and I guess the clinical term is defensive wound, but to be quite honest, the rabbi had his fingers shot off. 19-year-old man, John Ernest, is in custody now, and he's also under investigation for attempted arson at a nearby mosque at the end of March. There was an early morning arson attempt at a mosque in Escondido, California, March 24th. still unsolved, but in his online manifesto, discovered after he went into the synagogue and began shooting, Ernest claimed that he was inspired to set the fire at the mosque in Escondido by Brenton Tarrant, who is the murderer who killed 50 people at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. Ernest, not known to have any previous criminal record. San Diego Sheriff Bill Gore said that through the trail of digital evidence, police also will search his car and residence. That's been done by now, I'm sure. The mosque in Escondido spray painted with graffiti that made reference to the attacks in New Zealand. So, Gore, there's no other way to describe it. It is evil. And of course, as when anytime something like this happens, people on left and right will try to use it as a political football. But that's because many of us here in the West, in the United States, even though the majority of us profess to be Christians, we don't really give the spirit realm enough credit for the influence it may have on people like John Ernest, the alleged shooter in the attack in San Diego. By the way, before I forget to mention her name, the congregant at the synagogue who was killed is named Lori Kay, 60-year-old woman. Lori Kay was the one victim. The others are expected to recover. Ernest was either sold out to the dark side or at least listening to the dark side. The principalities, powers, cosmic rulers of this present darkness that the Apostle Paul wrote about. We don't recognize evil for what it is anymore. We start wondering, okay, was he mentally unbalanced? Was he radicalized somehow? Was he a white supremacist? Was he an anti-Semite? Etc., etc. Now, according to the things that police have found on his social media, it does appear that this guy was critical of Donald Trump, who he called a Zionist, Jew-loving, anti-white, traitorous, expletive deleted. But when things like this happen, we should set this aside and just say, look, this is evil. What he did was absolutely wrong. Doesn't matter what political reasons or excuses he gives to cover something like this. The bottom line is, he offered the dark gods that he served a blood sacrifice. Pray for his soul. Pray that he repents, because even the worst among us, we should not wish into the lake of fire. But like I said, this no doubt the shooting at the synagogue in San Diego tomorrow, when talk radio and cable news gets back to its regular routine of looking for grist for the mill, we will hear this brought up, no doubt, and used to justify tighter gun control and criticism of the Department of Homeland Security for disbanding its domestic terrorism unit that was specifically tasked with looking for right-wing terror groups. Because, as the progressives in America love to remind us, the real threat to security in the United States are white men. Now, the death toll in Sri Lanka from the horrific attacks last Sunday, Easter Sunday, or Resurrection Sunday if you prefer, that is our preferred term, has been lowered, actually, by more than 100. Last week we were being told that there were as many as 359 dead. That toll has now been reduced to 253. And it's because the bodies in the attacks were so badly mutilated that some of them were double counted by accident. Authorities were literally trying to have to piece together, and I don't mean this as a play on words, this is the actual gruesome truth. They had to piece together the death toll from the body parts that were discovered from the bombs detonated inside those churches and hotels. So 253 now, the death count. This was after officials were able to match up DNA on the remains that had been recovered by authorities. The top official in Sri Lanka's defense ministry Hemasiri Fernando has stepped down. They've admitted that they did not act on warnings that they were given. Intelligence officials in the West, intelligence officials in India, which is Sri Lanka's neighbor. Sri Lanka is an island off the south tip of India. Indian intelligence had shared with the Sri Lankan government several specific warnings about plans for attacks, but that information was not passed along to government ministers. I mean, this is a catastrophic failure. This is the kind of thing that governments are supposed to be for. I mean, this is what they're supposed to do. Security of the people that they govern is supposed to be like one of the 2 or 3 most important things that a government does, and it didn't. So again, the top official in the Sri Lankan Defense Ministry has stepped down. There will probably be others who lose their jobs. Sri Lanka's security forces have been trying to round up the culprits here. So far, they've arrested about 74 people. The Army, Navy, and Air Force have put about 3,000 troops on the streets to help police the streets. As you might guess, something like this happening for the first time, or at least for the first time in 10 years. Sri Lanka fought a rather bloody civil war that only ended about 10 years ago. And just as people were getting used to peace and security, well, the events of last Sunday shattered that in a wave of coordinated attacks as people went to church to worship. The Christian minority in Sri Lanka is less than 8% of the population. Most of them are Roman Catholics. The group blamed for the attacks affiliated with the Islamic State, National Tawhid Jama'at, or the NTJ. Again, there have been some warnings, and intelligence officials in some Western nations and next door India had tried to warn the government there, and sadly, that did not happen. In fact, the Sri Lankan government says that 2 more terrorists and a civilian were killed in a shootout between government troops and suspects tied to the Islamic State, or linked to the Islamic State anyway, took place Saturday morning. So again, they're still trying to round up the perpetrators of this event. Just a reminder that this happens around the world, and there are people more than happy to take their religion so seriously that they're willing to die for it and take a lot of innocent people with them. Now, one of the interesting things that happened in the wake of the attacks in Sri Lanka, because here in the West, here in the United States, the typical response from progressives, especially politicians, is to use social media to put out some statement of support for victims. And at times, it can be really ridiculous because the left in America has boxed itself into a corner when it comes to how they relate to Christians. I mean, they don't want to appear hateful, bigoted, or unloving, but at the same time, they just cannot bring themselves to say anything really positive about Jesus or Jesus Christ unless they recast him in a way that so that he bears no real relationship to the God of the Bible. Specifically, what I mean is this. On Monday of this week, both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama sent out tweets to express their condolences for the victims in Sri Lanka. And actually, these went out on Sunday after the attacks became known here in the West. But they really went out of their way to avoid mentioning the religious connection, the religious cause of the attacks. Basically, you had violent Islamists, Muslims, who detonated bombs to blow up as many Christians as they could. There's no way to sugarcoat it. That's what happened. But Hillary Clinton's tweet says, and I quote, "On this holy weekend for many faiths, we must stand united against hatred and violence. I'm praying for everyone affected by today's horrific attacks on Easter worshipers and travelers in Sri Lanka." End quote. Now, deconstructing this just a little bit, holy weekend for many faiths. To the best of my knowledge, and I'm reasonably well informed, last weekend was holy for Christians celebrating the resurrection of Jesus Christ and Jews who were celebrating Passover and the subsequent Feast of Unleavened Bread. Those are the two religions that, as far as I know, found last weekend to be holy, or were celebrating last weekend as holy days. But notice that she didn't say Jews and Christians. And again, since police very quickly in Sri Lanka identified the victims as Christians who had gathered for services on Easter Sunday, I think the accurate term would have been this horrific attack on Christians in Sri Lanka, on Christian worship. Easter worshipers is sort of accurate if you mean worshipers on Easter, but it's a very clever way of avoiding use of the C word, which is not allowed in progressive circles in America today. Barack Obama's tweet was similar. The attacks on tourists and Easter worshipers in Sri Lanka are an attack on humanity. End quote. Well, the tourists who were there again to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Christians, a minority in Sri Lanka, and a minority that until last Sunday had pretty much been left alone. What violence there had been in the past had been between Muslims and Buddhists, for the most part, who make up the majority of the population in Sri Lanka. But again, when the bombs were detonated inside Roman Catholic parishes during Mass on Easter Sunday, it's pretty safe to say the attacks on Christians celebrating the resurrection of Jesus would have been more accurate than the term Easter worshipers, because the Christians there weren't worshiping Easter. They were worshiping Jesus Christ, presumably, and it wouldn't have hurt anyone to say so, except politically. It would have hurt the standings of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton in the eyes of their supporters. Because again, in 21st century America today, apparently the C word is now off limits for progressives. This is just... Slate, which is a very left-wing online publication, had to respond to the backlash because a lot of conservatives, a lot of Christians, yours truly included, thought this was just ridiculous to bend over backwards to avoid mentioning the word Christian. And so Slate actually published an article defending use of the phrase Easter worshipers instead of Christians. It's like, if you're a progressive or liberal in America today, there's a danger of having an allergic reaction if you're exposed to the word Christ or Christian. But in America today, you can't say anything nice about Christians. You can't say anything bad about Muslims. Now, contrast this to the way Obama and Hillary tweeted out responses after the attacks on Christchurch, the mosques in Christchurch. We stand with the Muslim community, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, all right, that's fine. Expressing sympathy for the victims and the families of victims of a horrific, evil, unconscionable act. But when the shoe is on the other foot, they just can't use the C word. Well, elsewhere, as we continue on A View from the Bunker, in Israel, the weekly protests by Hamas at the Gaza Strip. Once again, 8,000 Palestinians protest along the border. They claim 31 people were wounded. The Israel Defense Forces had no comments. This has been going on since last March, part of the Hamas-sponsored, what are they calling it? The March of Return demonstrations? Or more like the Riots of Return. We were there last year in May. The riots began in March. Things heated up a little bit, and we received many phone calls. Emails, really. A couple of phone calls from people back here in the United States. Trust me, when you're over there in Jerusalem and the historic sites in Judea and Samaria, which is what the world calls the West, or what the world calls the West Bank, Judea and Samaria to the Israelis. It's like it's happening somewhere else, like in another continent. Yes, you see police, you see soldiers on the streets, but the Israelis know how to deal with it. So, Hamas sponsoring riots on the border. The rest of Israel just goes about business as usual. Interestingly, Hamas has launched a new program, an experimental program, to use cryptocurrency to raise money from international donors. Very clever about trying to find ways to support their need for weapons. And so cryptocurrency now being used apparently by Hamas to get around the difficulty of getting hard cash into the Gaza Strip. The Mueller report, of course, it was released a week ago Thursday. It was really not much there. Democrats just can't seem to let it go, of course. Unlike, when Bill Clinton was impeached but was not convicted by the Senate, and then the battle cry of Democrats across America was, move on! Move on! Quit talking about Bill Clinton and his peccadillos. Move on! Well, not so much now with Donald Trump and the Mueller report. I'm not going to dive into this because talking heads on cable news networks have been beating this to death for the last week, but it is interesting to note that the Mueller report actually included a reference that the Russian government recorded, shall we say, compromising telephone calls between Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky back in the 90s. Specifically, he recorded Clinton and Lewinsky engaging in phone sex. But apparently, according to sources cited by the Washington Examiner, this claim was, this reference was redacted from the Mueller report, or the version that's been released to the public. Now, Republicans are a little ticked off about that because this allegation has been known. It's out in the public domain. It's been known for 18 years. Since 2001, it's been available to anybody who's wanted to dig into this, that the Russians had recordings of Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, but for whatever reason, it was found necessary to redact this information from the Mueller report. However, the Mueller report did not redact the reference to the claims that President Trump watched prostitutes urinating on a bed in a hotel in Moscow, which is a claim that has absolutely no evidence to support it whatsoever. So again, kind of a double standard there, but interesting that this information has been, or that the Russians, if they had any, what do they call it, compromising information on an American politician, apparently they got more on the Clintons than they do on Donald Trump. House Majority Whip James Clyburn, he's a Democrat from South Carolina, was interviewed on one of the Talking Heads programs this morning on ABC, said it was interesting that Donald Trump is, quote, glorifying a loser, end quote, like Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And again, this is the left bringing up the whole Charlottesville, Virginia thing again, which, by the way, Vice President Joe Biden, former Vice President Joe Biden, referenced in his kickoff announcement to launch his campaign. Joe Biden is now in the race and leading the polls. It's interesting that Democrats, the woke party of #MeToo, the two leading candidates who between them have more than half of Democratic voters' support, are the two oldest white men in the race, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. Anyway, Clyburn said it's interesting that President Donald Trump is glorifying a loser like General Robert E. Lee. Look, I don't want to get into this whole topic. It's ridiculous that we've come to a point in America where you cannot point out what should be obvious about the military mind of Robert E. Lee and the man's character. I mean, we could do a whole program just on who Robert E. Lee was, and there have been, many books written about him. I'm not going to summarize him adequately in 30 seconds here. But for anybody to say that Robert E. Lee was a loser is ignorant of history. But again, we're at a place in America where there are certain groups about which nothing good can be said. white men are one, and white men who served the Confederacy during the American Civil War are right at the top of the list, or very close to it anyway. But the fact is that General Robert E. Lee probably did more with less than any American military commander in history, or at least nearly any. So for Clyburn to bring this up and just use this, the implication, of course, being that Donald Trump is a racist, which is a drum that they're going to keep beating. Beto O'Rourke, who seems to have lost some of the luster of his early campaign, spoke to literally dozens of people in Las Vegas this past week, not generating the excitement that he's not able to maintain the early excitement of his campaign launch. Beto O'Rourke has an interesting solution to the chronic problem of poor nutrition in poorer communities here in the United States. The so-called food deserts that exist in poorer neighborhoods. During an event on Friday hosted by the Nevada State Democratic Party, he suggested that farm-to-table restaurants be established in every community to combat poor nutrition. Farm-to-table restaurants. I had not heard this term before, had to do some research. Apparently, that's kind of a trendy term. It's a sustainable, health-conscious movement currently in vogue. Involves serving meals using ingredients directly sourced from small, sustainable farms. The problem is that because these are trendy, these meals are typically sold at prices that people who live in impoverished neighborhoods wouldn't be able to afford. So, shows a real disconnect with the reality of the problem and a political tone deafness. Beto O'Rourke, Robert Francis O'Rourke, don't think he's really going to get the traction he needs. Meanwhile, President Trump was in Wisconsin Saturday night. He skipped the White House Correspondents' Dinner. You might remember last year how the alleged comedian Michelle Wolf just savaged Sarah Sanders. So the president decided to skip it. Sarah Sanders skipped it as well, and she was with the president in Wisconsin, where they filled a stadium. And the president said, "There's no place I'd rather be than right here in America's heartland." This was at Packed Arena in Green Bay, Wisconsin. President Trump's political instincts, he's not the most eloquent guy, but his political instincts are really, really good. And the fact that pundits in Washington, D.C. still don't understand why people in the heartland like Donald Trump is just indicative of how out of touch they are with the majority of Americans. And here's another example of why things are how out of touch they are. The White House correspondent for the New York Times, which is supposed to be the premier newspaper in the United States, Maggie Haberman, a week ago, just was livid that it was reported the White House was playing the song Edelweiss on, sound system or something, as reporters were coming into the White House for some event. You know the song, the old folk song. Edelweiss, Edelweiss, da, 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 da. She freaked out. Said, does anyone at the White House, she didn't say this, she tweeted it, does anyone at the White House understand the significance of that song? And a lot of people who follow her on Twitter pointed out, well, yeah, it's from the 1965 Academy Award-winning Best Picture Sound of Music. It was sort of an anti-Nazi song that recalled the days of Austria, the happy days before the rise of the Nazi Party. But apparently, Maggie Haberman, the White House correspondent for the New York Times, is culturally illiterate, does not have that frame of reference. She connected it to the recent series on Amazon Prime, Man in the High Castle. Well-done series based on a novel by Philip K. Dick, in which the intro every week on this series uses the song Edelweiss, but in sort of an ironic manner. Because if you're not familiar with the story, Man in the High Castle, it's an alternative history in which the Nazis, the Axis powers, won World War II. So it's about what America would have been like if we'd lost the war. And the Germans took over, the Nazis took over the eastern part of the United States, everything east of the Rockies, and west of the Rockies went to the Japanese. So in that context, Edelweiss, ironic and kind of melancholy. But that's not how it was portrayed in 1965 in The Sound of Music. So anyway, this is the media in America today. And this is why President Trump gets away with calling them the enemy of the American people, because they're clueless about what life is like out here in the heartland. And they don't see why President Trump won in the first place. They don't understand why he's going to win in a landslide in 2020. He gets the American public, people like Beto O'Rourke, and everyone else, the other 27 candidates running in the Democratic side, don't. Well, coming up, another man who gets the American public, and he's got a story to tell. He rides because they died. Tony Price, Executive Director of the Gold Star Ride Foundation, joins us straight ahead. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.
The harvest field is widening, and we have an unprecedented opportunity to reach a lost generation during what may be our final years here on Earth. SkyWatchTV is proud to announce the Everyday Champions Ultimate Collection. This unbelievable collection includes Everyday Champions, where you'll discover the most overlooked spiritual gifts in the Bible. Learn to identify and operate in your own supernatural God-given gifting. Discover what Paul actually meant when he wrote about the uncomely parts of the body of Christ. You'll meet real-life champions whose small investments equal huge contributions to the kingdom of God. And I personally share my experiences in both authentic and superficial religious institutions. In this timely collection, you'll also receive the Everyday Champions 4-week Skywatch television series on DVD, including interviews with Allie Anderson, myself, Joe Horn, Derek Gilbert, Dr. Thomas Horn, and Donna Howell. But we're just getting started. You'll also receive Allie Anderson's new book, Unscrambling the Millennial Paradox, which is already being described as a definitive and urgent analysis regarding so-called unreachable millennials as key to the future of the church. You'll discover what devastating modern epidemics are sweeping our youth away from God, and what believers can do to intervene. How modern identity politics and economic stressors have robbed our youth of an opportunity to confront their destiny, and the real reason millennials are leaving the church, and what the body of Christ can do to reverse this trend before it's too late. This incredible collection also includes the Unscrambling the Millennial Paradox 13-week Teacher's Guide PDF on disc, perfect for small group discussion, church curricular use, teaching or preaching series, personal use or education. But we're still not done. At Skywatch TV, we are committed to reaching this generation with solid biblical teaching, which is why we're including free, that's right, free, the beautiful, classically oversized, strong, systematic theology 3-volume set. These large books are perfect for the researcher in your life and hold a retail value all by themselves of $150. Yours now for a limited time, absolutely free when you order the Everyday Champions Ultimate Collection. Sold separately, this huge assortment holds a retail value of $250. Yours now for your donation of only $35 plus shipping and handling. Now's your chance to be part of what may be the greatest awakening the world has ever seen. Order the Everyday Champions Ultimate Collection online now at the Skywatch TV store or call 1-844-750-4985.
Live from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks every Sunday night, this is A View from the Bunker. Coming up in our final segment tonight, alien-human hybrids are here. Yes, an Oxford professor says so it must be true, and he says they will save humanity. We'll explain exactly what that's all about after 8:30 Central Time. Just kidding. Just because an Oxford professor says it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. I'm Derek Gilbert, and we move now to our interview segment tonight. This is a gentleman who spends an awful lot of time on the back of a bike. And by bike, I mean the kind that I have never been brave enough to ride. And he puts a lot of miles on it. Thousands of miles. He's the author of Yours Very Sincerely and Respectfully, the true story of the Gold Star Ride Foundation's 2018 journey across, around, and through America, honoring Gold Star families. The executive director of the Gold Star Ride Foundation. It is our honor to welcome Tony Price to the program. Tony, welcome.
Thank you. So wonderful to be here.
This is how many miles do you put on your motorcycle when you ride for an event like this?
Well, I have to admit, I just ride as much as I can. When we did this last event in 2018, we took off on the first Monday in July, and I think I made it back home to Minneapolis here somewhere around the last Thursday in August. And during that time, I think it was the average was 375 miles a day, 7 days a week while I was out on the road. So there were, to get to 375 as an average, there's got to be a lot of days when you're when you're doing 550 or 600 miles, and there's a lot of days when you're doing, 200 miles or 150 miles. I don't think I had any days under 200, but the goal was to let people know what a Gold Star family is and why they're important, and of course to honor them as we were traveling around. So, it's not just about the miles; it's about making sure that everybody knows that there's no one family that's a Gold Star family that's more important than another Gold Star family. And it's about stopping in 44 states, and it's about visiting more than 60 families around the country.
So for people not familiar with the term, what is a Gold Star family?
That's an excellent way to get things started. Let's dive right into that. A Gold Star family is the designation that we give to family members, immediate family members of anyone who's died in the service. So, yeah, it's not a real complicated definition. If your mother, father, son, daughter, brother, or sister put on a uniform, and there's not very many people in the United States who put on that uniform.
That's true.
But if somebody did put on the uniform and you had a funeral for them, that's pretty much all it takes. And it's a very sobering way to meet people. But the people that I ended up meeting are the greatest people in the world. I just can't say enough kind things about the people that I met on my journey last year. I think that when it was all done, it was just under 18,000 miles.
18,000 miles, just on that.
Just under 18,000 miles on that trip, and of course we've put on some miles since then, and we've gone to visit Gold Star families since then. But as somebody else put it to me once, he said, "I bet there's a lot of puddles." So, yeah, that kind of rings true. There's a lot of tears, but there's a lot more reasons to shed a tear than just sadness. Sometimes it's just an overwhelming emotional experience. It's not necessarily sad, but the tears still come out. And I've been somebody who believes that tears are an incredibly important part of our life. You can't shed a tear without an enormous amount of emotion, whether it's love or joy or sadness. So all tears, I think, are really, really important.
And often very therapeutic. So just to clarify, the Gold Star families, the soldiers who fell, men and women, were they soldiers who lost their lives in the line of duty?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Most of them that was true, but not necessarily. We mentioned that there aren't very many people who put the uniform on. So it's okay for me, I hope, to just kind of drop a statistic here.
Please.
Right now, what do we have? 430 million people in the country, something like that? I think
it's about 327. But
327.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a nice big number. But out of those, it's only been 6.56%, I think, that have ever put on a uniform. Out of all of those people who are alive today, just under 7% have ever put on a uniform. I'm proud to say that I'm one of those. And then the people who are serving right now, the people who are out there protecting us right now, that number is less than half of 1% of the total population.
So these are people, and having known some veterans, and by the way, thank you for volunteering. It was not something I was called upon to do.
Glad I could do it.
And not something I chose to do. But the older I get, and the more I have a better frame of reference about the type of sacrifice that involves in terms of family and the danger that can be involved, especially today in some of the tasks that our military has been given. It kind of registers a little bit more with me as to the gratitude I have for those who have chosen to do it. There are stories that I've read years ago when I was a kid. We had a fascination with military aircraft, and so I read everything I could get my hands on about the air wars of World War II. But
there's a lot of sobering stories there.
There are. Visiting, for example, the USS Yorktown Memorial in Charleston, and seeing the memorial to that group of torpedo bombers at the Battle of Midway, I believe it was, and realizing that these young men realized they didn't have enough fuel to get back to their carrier, and they decided to press on and attack anyway, hoping that maybe they could slow down the Japanese fleet just long enough for their other planes to find out where this Japanese fleet was that they'd been searching for. And then realizing that these kids were 18, 19, 20 years old at the time they did it. I began to weep. It's so, and there were sacrifices, things that happen like that even today in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and other theaters around the world. So it's a little more, I guess, real, even though I never put on the uniform. And so
there are a lot of ways to support without putting on a uniform. So allow me to just share that information.
Well, please, yes.
Yeah. So the way to as long as we're supporting the military, is the contrast to use here is what was going on in the 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. So as long as we're actually supporting the military, we still have a long way to go to give up for our society in general to be able to give up the honor and the respect that our military forces deserve to have. So we still have a long way to go. But what was going on back then, there's stories about this, and I wrote about one of them in the book because I was a sailor myself, so I have a soft spot for sailor stories. But I met a guy who served on the USS Enterprise, I believe it was, in 1968 when it started on fire. That fire on that aircraft carrier is now one of the training videos that I got to see when I was in boot camp, and they still use it as a training video for how to make sure you put the fire out. But anyway, he was telling me the story. He served it there, and he was in the West Pacific Theater over there by Vietnam for 3 years. And then he took his discharge, and they flew him from the Westpac into Hawaii and then into California. When he got off the plane in California, back then, we didn't have the gates at the airport like we do now. So the planes would land, and they'd have to walk down the steps and walk across the tarmac to go through the terminal.
Right.
And he gets there, and he sees about 250 people lined up along the walkway there, and he's thinking, wow, this is kind of nice, and a little surprise party to welcome me home. And as he gets up and walks past them, they start throwing water balloons on him.
Oh, wow.
And as the water balloons break, he realizes they're all filled with urine.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And that's just one of the horrific examples of how we treated the military during the Vietnam conflict in particular. We can all remember that. Okay, I was alive then. I have memories of things that happened. I was pretty young, but I have some memories of what was going on there in Vietnam and when those guys were coming home. And I have a real soft spot still today for the Vietnam veterans in particular. But they're still around, and they still remember, and they still have to live with those memories. And we need to use that as our measuring stick, for lack of better terminology, to how we're moving forward, and we still have room to grow, to pay more respect to our men and women in the military, but we've come a long, long way.
We're talking with Tony Price on A View from the Bunker. He's the executive director of the Gold Star Ride Foundation and author of the book Yours Very Sincerely and Respectfully. Tony, what was it that led you to begin the Gold Star Ride Foundation?
That's one of my favorite stories to tell. Here's the thing. I've been riding motorcycles forever. I think I was 9, first time I got on a motorized two-wheeler. And, I grew up in rural southern Minnesota farm community, so all the farmers' kids had these little dirt bikes, and we would go riding around on dirt bikes to get from one farm to the next, and we'd, cut across the cornfields and whatever. So that's where it all began. But I've always enjoyed motorcycling, and it's always been a part of my life. So I was hanging out at a golf tournament for an organization called Tee It Up for the Troops, and they're quite a spectacular little organization. I shouldn't say they're little anymore. I think they do golf tournaments for disabled veterans in all 50 states now. I think they've been around for about 10 or 12 years. So I was helping them out at one of these golf tournaments, and a whole bunch of bikers just showed up, a whole bunch of motorcyclists. And I'm talking to them a little bit, and they said, "We're going to go on a ride tomorrow. Why don't you come with us?" And I said, "All right, that sounds like a lot of fun. We'll do that." I had the day off and some time off. So my wife and I saddled up on a motorcycle, and we went for a ride with these guys. And there was about 125 motorcycles that showed up in the staging area. So we're all getting started. There's a little safety briefing, because we all got to follow the same rules to make sure, safety's number one. And then we go out for a ride. And I'm about a third of the way into the pack. So there's about a third of the motorcycles in front of me and 2/3 behind me. And we're just out having a lot of fun and just going down the road. And then all of a sudden we turn into a residential district, after a residential part of town on the north side of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm thinking, why are we going this way? We got 125 motorcycles here out for a ride. Why are we going into a residential neighborhood? And then the leader of the group took us down a dead-end street. And I was a little bit taken aback by that, too. I was like, wait a minute, how are we going to turn around 125 motorcycles on a dead-end street? What's going on here? And then they started parking. So we're all parking the motorcycles. And I don't know if you've ever seen 125 motorcycles parked in a one-block area of a street.
It takes up a little space.
But yeah, so they all back their tires up to the curbs, and they park them as close together as they can, and they fill up the street on both sides, and then the motorcycles are still coming in. And there's a cul-de-sac there, so a big round area, and they filled up that with motorcycles. And then they parked the motorcycles perpendicular to the road, right down the middle of the road. So there was nothing but a walkway between the bikes parked in the middle of the road and the bikes parked against the curb on both sides. And we all just filed up into this one front yard at the end of the street. And as I'm walking up there, I'm looking around at all these houses, and everybody's pulling their shades closed and they're peeking around their curtains. Because, you have to remember what we look like.
Right.
Sunglasses, bandanas, fingerless gloves, leather jackets, leather pants, boots, the smell of oil and gas and rubber. And the sound would shake the windows. With 125 motorcycles, that'll make a little noise. Mm-hmm. And then we pulled up. We all walked into this. Everybody's standing around in the front yard of this one house, and the leader of the group comes knocking on the door and opened up the door, and out comes this woman, probably in her early 20s, maybe 25 years old, and she's holding an infant baby, and she's got a toddler clinging to her leg. And then he starts telling the story about why we came to visit this particular young woman in this particular house. She married her high school sweetheart, who joined the Army on the buddy system with his best friend. They'd known each other since they were 5 years old. And they went off fighting off in the Middle East. And the best friend was killed by an IED while they were standing next to each other.
Oh, wow.
So one was killed in a very dramatic way, and her husband survived the attack. But his best friend just disappeared. So, of course, everything that you can imagine took place in his world. Post-traumatic stress kicked in, and all the guilt of why him and not me, and all of the cliches that you've ever heard about these kind of things took place. Well, they put him in a hospital for 60 days, and after 60 days, they said post-traumatic stress gets 60 days. Back then, they called it a disorder. And this was quite a few years ago. But they called it a disorder back then. We don't call it a disorder anymore, but... Anyway, after 60 days, they let him go. And the short story is he lasted about 6 days on the street.
Oh, wow.
And he took his own life. And back then, again, this is a little bit of history here, but back then, the idea of suicide was not part of the military contract. So she and her 2 little babies were cut off without any benefits whatsoever. No survivor's benefits at all. So this, as lousy as that story is, then, I was standing up as close to the house as I could get because I wanted to make sure I heard every syllable that was being said about this story. And I looked out over this front lawn, and there wasn't a dry eye in the place. There was tears rolling down the cheeks of every one of them, leather-clad, bandana-wearing cigarette-smoking bikers that were standing there. And then everybody just kind of opened up their wallet. We put her back to school because she graduated from high school, but she didn't have any college or anything. And she was looking at being a welfare mom without any benefits and nothing else she could do. She couldn't afford daycare. So we put her back to school, and now she's a thriving member of her community. And that's when I knew, before I left that lady's front yard, I knew that I was going to dedicate my life to making sure that I continued to do this kind of thing, because that's when it became extremely important to me.
So there's more to this than just riding your cycle to various communities to meet with people, families of those who've lost their lives. There's what else is involved as part of the Gold Star Ride Foundation?
Well, we'll give them anything that they need help with. I got an email last week from a woman in Florida whose father was killed, and she's like 20 years old or something. And she was living in the back of her car. And I thought, this is just ridiculous. This guy, and I looked up her dad's record, and it was, a public matter of public access. You could, if I gave you his name, you could Google it and find out. He's got a Wikipedia page and all kinds of stuff about him. He's won every commendation that the military has to offer outside of the Medal of Honor. He even picked up the Navy Cross, which is the number 2 medal. And he served for 15 years, and he died in this incredibly gallant way, and he had this wonderful history that he provided for our country, and he was the 3rd-generation military man. His father and his grandfather both served before him, and his daughter's living in her car. And I just think that's just the most embarrassing thing that I could come up with. As a nation, we're going to allow our heroes' families to suffer like that? That's just ridiculous. By the way, our enemies don't do that. The guys that go put on a suicide vest and go blow themselves up, their families get taken care of forever.
Yeah.
That's the trade-off. That's how they get those young guys to put those vests on. They just say, hey, look, you guys are living in, with a dirt floor and no running water, and we're going to set you up. Your family's going to have a full refrigerator, a nice house, electricity, running water, even internet service. We'll take care of everything for your family. All you got to do is go get on a city bus with this vest. So it's really quite embarrassing that that's one of the things that our enemies are doing to help, or so to try to kill as many of us as they can, or as many citizens of the world that don't believe the same things they believe, and that's what they're doing. So the idea that we have a daughter of a hero who's got to sleep in her car is just ridiculous. So in the last couple of months, we've had 2 of those come in, one from Florida and one from Texas. And we do everything we can for those people that we meet along the way. I met a 12-year-old boy in Pennsylvania. We set him up with a college fund.
Wow.
So his father was killed when he was 3 months old, so he never got to meet his father. And his was another one of those bizarre stories where him and his mom were cut off without any benefits. So we just made sure that's because if his father would have lived, his father would have made sure that he could go to college. So that's kind of our philosophy. We're just going to do whatever they would have done if they would have lived. We're going to just help with whatever we can. If somebody calls me up and says, my dad was killed wherever, and I'm 15 now, I'd like to learn how to drive a car. I'll say, okay, let's get together. I'll put you behind the wheel, and we'll, as long as it's legal.
Yeah.
Here in Minnesota, I couldn't do that because a 15-year-old can only drive with a parent. But, if that's what it takes, if they need some help learning how to drive a car, we'll teach them how to drive a car. If they're a 5-year-old that needs a treehouse built, we'll figure out how to build that treehouse. If they're whatever their circumstances are, if their immediate family member that was killed in the military would have been there to step up and do that, that's what we step up and do.
So how do you pull together this network then? Because clearly you can't do all of this by yourself. You got to have guys, men and women in other parts of the country that pull this together. So how do you coordinate? Who do you reach out to when an inquiry comes in?
Well, when an inquiry comes in, we just handle it here in our offices. We've got a handful, and when I say handful, I mean 3 volunteers that sit here and answer the phones and respond to emails. And as the co-founder of the organization, the Gold Star Ride Foundation, I make sure that I put my fingerprints on just about everything. Anybody who any Gold Star family that calls, they're going to talk to me personally. They're not going to talk to one of our volunteers until after they've had a chance to talk to me. I've had some training in counseling, and I've been through an awful lot of stuff myself. So at this time, we don't every conversation goes through me first. And then I delegate it out to the volunteers that are here to make sure that they know when we're going to show up and what day and what kind of things that we need. And our volunteers will contact all of the support people that we need in that particular town, wherever it is. For example, we went to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and we contacted a restaurant and a hotel and told them what we were doing and made sure that those businesses that we wanted to help us were there to help us. In fact, when we did get to Harrisburg, the restaurant put out a nice buffet for everybody that was there, and there were 85 people that showed up to help us honor the Gold Star mom that was there. 3 fire trucks were in the parking lot. They made a huge parade. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And we have those kind of things happen all over, everywhere we go.
Well, you anticipated my question. Yeah, I was just going to ask, how typical is that when you go out and around? Is there a difference between a smaller community and say, a larger city?
Yeah, believe it or not, the smaller towns that we go to, more people show up.
Actually, that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, the bigger towns that we go to, I didn't talk to too many people about it, so I couldn't tell you exactly what they're thinking. But the other thing is we try to avoid the bigger cities.
Oh, okay.
Because we don't know if we're going to pull into town and we're going to be greeted by 100 motorcycles that are going to ride along with us when we get there. If we're in Chicago, we're going to be running into some trouble with the logistics of getting 100 motorcycles through town.
Yeah.
So we kind of tried to avoid the larger cities. But we went to San Antonio, Texas, which it's a big city by geographic measure. And we were greeted by about a half a dozen motorcycles when we got there. So that turned out pretty good. And then we were in a small town in South Dakota. We stopped in there, and I all of these things I wrote about in the book too. So, they're a little bit more detailed there. But when we were in that small town in South Dakota, I was greeted. I stopped about a half hour, 25 miles, I think, out of town. I stopped to fill up my tank to make sure and I got there and I found 30 motorcycles waiting for me. And when I went inside to settle up with the gas, I asked the people who were working there, I said, how long have these bikes been sitting here? They said, they've been waiting for you for 2.5 hours.
Wow.
I said, well, that's dedication. That's what it's all about. And that was, those are the kind of things that really make me feel like I'm doing something that I'm supposed to do. And then on that particular one, if you don't mind me finishing that story.
No, please.
All of those motorcycles rode right into town. We just, paraded right through town and stopped in front of a house. And we met a 93-year-old woman whose oldest son was killed in Vietnam. And she was quoted later to say that it was the first time anybody ever gave her any attention whatsoever because she lost her son in the military.
Wow.
I think it was 51 years before I got there that her son was killed. Which brings up another thing real quick here. Mm-hmm. We don't draw the line. There's no calendar with a line in it that says we're not going to go past this. Mm-hmm. I visited a woman in the Quad Cities of Iowa whose father was killed in Korea. We visited a family in Mount Pleasant. Where's Mount Pleasant? Michigan. Mount Pleasant, Michigan. And that was a woman whose son was killed in Vietnam also. That was an interesting story because the son was killed after he had a 3-year enlistment and he volunteered. So he wasn't drafted. He volunteered. Did a 3-year enlistment, was killed after 2.5 years. His younger brother volunteered to finish his tour.
Wow.
So there's an incredible amount of patriotism that's available in this country. And we just need to spread it out a little bit more. Let everybody know what's going on. Let everybody know how important these Gold Star families are, what kind of a sacrifice they made for the rest of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And that there's nothing wrong with being patriotic here, contrary to what we might, the impression we might get from the media and certain segments of the political spectrum here. We'll set that aside, but we're going to continue our conversation. Tony Price is our guest on A View from the Bunker. He's the executive director of the Gold Star Ride Foundation, online at goldstarride.org, and the author of the book, Yours Very Sincerely and Respectfully, The True Story of the Gold Star Ride Foundation's 2018 Journey Across, Around, and Through America, Honoring Gold Star Families. Our conversation continues in just a minute on A View from the Bunker.
Jack the Ripper's dark deeds actually began long before 1888. And it wasn't a mere man who committed the crimes, but a demon in league with devilish men, a group of men called Red Wing. Only one small group of valiant men and women stand against this evil, a group that place their faith in Christ alone, and they protect a secret of blood that Red Wing hopes to use to usher in the reign of Antichrist and the end of day.
Red Wing is called Red Wing because they want to kill the church. They want to forever stop Christ from coming back. So it's the Holy Spirit, the dove, with a murdered, has been slain, a wounded dove. Ultimately, we still have to remember that the one who is in control is God Almighty, and we have to go to Him, and we have to suit up every time we go out.
The Red Wing Saga by Sharon Gilbert.
Book 1.
Blood Lies.
Book 2.
Blood Rights.
Book 3.
The Blood is the Life.
Book 4.
Realms of Stone.
And now available Book 5.
Realms of Fire. Available at SkyWatchTVstore.com. Paperback and Kindle at Amazon.com. Characters you'll love and a story you can't put down. The Red Wing Saga by Sharon Gilbert. Driving the internet to think. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Our final segment tonight. Yes, it's like the plot of the X-Files, but an Oxford professor believes it's true. We'll talk more about that in just about half an hour. But first, we return to our guest, an intriguing mission and an important one for those who are served. We're talking with Tony Price, Executive Director of the Gold Star Ride Foundation. Tony, I'm curious, the bikers who join you on these rides around the country to honor the families of soldiers who've passed on, are most of them military veterans?
Well, let me answer that question this way. It's been my experience that what's a good word to use here? If we're talking about members of society or groups in society, like you got truck drivers, you got military people, you got bikers, you got different sects of the population. No two sectors of the population cross over more than bikers and veterans.
Ah, okay.
So more bikers are veterans and more veterans are bikers than any other two groups that you can find in U.S. society. Things like the world famous Sturgis rally in southwestern South Dakota over there by Mount Rushmore. That was started by guys who came back from World War II, and they were a little bit bored, so they wanted something to do, and they just agreed that 5 of them, I think, or 6, some really, really small number, just agreed to meet the first week in August over there in the Black Hills and ride their motorcycles around the Black Hills. Now, the last time I was at that rally, which was 4 years ago, I guess, 1.6 million motorcycles showed up there.
Wow.
The amount of bikers who are also veterans and the amount of veterans who are also bikers is a huge percentage. So that just happens. Now, of course, not all bikers are veterans. Not all veterans are bikers. But there is a very large percentage of both of those groups that crosses over to the other.
So the ride that you wrote about in the book, very sincerely and respectfully, yours very sincerely and respectfully, the 2018 ride. How many riders did you have join that particular ride?
Well, I did the ride around the country alone. So I did the 18,000 mile part of the ride. That was done pretty much all by me. However, when I left Minneapolis on July 2nd, there were 3 motorcycles that left with me. We met another one along the way, and then I rode alone until I got to Lockport, New York. I was joined by a few bikers up there, and then I was alone until I got to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I already talked about that one. And then I was alone until I got to Louisville, Kentucky, but I got to Louisville from New York by way of Florida. So it was a big circle. So I was met by a few in Louisville, Kentucky, and I was met by a few in Wichita, Kansas, San Antonio, Texas, Salem, Oregon, and South Dakota. The one I mentioned in South Dakota. There was a couple bikers when I was in Colorado as well. There's a couple guys there. But when I think of Colorado and what happened in Colorado, I think, well, I took that wrong road. I shouldn't have taken that road in Colorado. I ended up 13,000 feet in the air with elevation sickness, and then it started snowing.
Oh.
So I got to ride in the snow on, I think it was August 20th, give or take a few days. And, you know, that's not something everybody thinks about. It's August 20th. We're going to go ride our motorcycles in the snow. Nah, that's a little bit of a weird.
Yeah, and especially when you're a little lightheaded. 13,000 feet, that's a couple of miles up.
That wasn't the only place where I rode my motorcycle with gripping the handlebars so tight that my knuckles turned white. But it was a place where I did that.
Well,
so, yeah, there was most of the ride I did by myself.
Now, what was it that inspired you to do that and then to write about it? What was the motivation to sit down and write a book? Having written a few, I know that there's more work involved there than most people realize. So why did you take on that project after doing the ride?
Being somebody who has written a couple books, you'll probably be impressed with this little cute statistic. It took me 58 days to do the ride. Mm-hmm. It took me 42 days to write the book.
That is impressive.
Well, you know, when you're dedicated, you know, that it took me 42 days to write the book. But I didn't tell you that I would start writing every morning about 10 minutes after I got out of bed, and I'd stop writing every night about 5 minutes before I got into bed. So I wrote 7 days a week for 42 days for about 12 or 15 hours a day.
Well, I've had a couple of periods like that when I'm under a deadline, but I don't try to make a habit out of that. It's a tough schedule to keep.
I think it has kind of become somebody who I am. This is the project, and I'm just going to do this project until it's done. And that might have been something that I learned from doing the motorcycle ride. Allow this cute little aside. There was a Marine. I want to say he was from Kentucky, and his first name is Dakota. And Dakota had an unusual skill. His father taught him how to hunt and fish at a very young age, and he could shoot the head off a squirrel at 300 yards.
That's a long ways.
That's a small target.
Yes, yes.
So when he joined the Marines, they made him a sniper, and he was doing a thing in Afghanistan, and his unit went in to talk to the village elders, and they left the sniper and the medic up on top of the hill outside of town to kind of watch what was going on. Anyway, it turned out to be a Taliban trap, and as soon as the unit got in there, just all kinds of bullets just rained from the sky. Everybody jumped up from the top of every building, and they just opened fire. And they called in for help, and he's sitting up at the top of the hill going, okay, these are my guys. I need to help my guys. And the air support never came. The air support, which is a different story altogether. So he grabs the medic and says, you drive, get in this truck. And he jumps in the back of this small pickup truck with a machine gun. The medic is driving. They go right into the heart of the city while he's shooting out at the back of this truck. They grab 5 guys, lay them in the back of the truck, run back up the hill and kick them out. And then they go back down into the city, or into the village again, into this rain of fire. They get back up again, and now the gun's been hit a couple of times. I think he was shot in the arm. They switched trucks. They go back for more. When it was all over and done, he'd made 6 trips into that rain of fire.
Wow.
And saved 36 men.
Wow.
However, the 4 Americans that were leading that group, he saved 36 Afghani fighters. And the 4 that were Americans that he was after, when he got to them, they had already been killed. So when you ask him, or when he was asked, I should say, I saw this on 60 Minutes. So when he was asked, they asked him, do you know what you did was extraordinary? He said, no. If I would have got him out, it would have been extraordinary. And then the next thing he said was, you either get him out or you die trying. And if you didn't die trying, you didn't try hard enough.
Wow.
And that became my mantra on the motorcycle. Going through incredibly intense pressure to get this mission done, to get to the next town, to ride 700 miles in the rain, to ride across the top of the mountain in the snow, to go from San Antonio, Texas to Phoenix, Arizona, 3 days, every inch was over 100 degrees. To do that kind of stuff, every time I'd stop for gas, I go, what the heck am I doing here? Nobody would know if I just called it quits and I'll sell my motorcycle to the next guy comes on the street and I'll hitchhike home. Nobody will ever know. But I would know.
Right.
And I continued to repeat to myself that same thing that he said. You either get it done or you die trying. And there was a time I broke down up in upstate New York, and it was an incredibly long day. I'd been riding a motorcycle like 17 hours to get there. I was an hour late to meet this Gold Star family, and my motorcycle broke down a mile away from where I was supposed to go. And I was just exhausted. Everything was gone. I parked the motorcycle, I climb off it, and I fall down on the ground. I'm just laying there on the ground, and I'm going, who's going to know? If I just quit right here, who's going to know? And then I took another breath, and I said, well, I'm still alive, so I better keep going. And that just kind of became how I got this thing done. And, it's easy to talk. If conditions are perfect, if everything is perfect, 18,000 miles in 58 days is quite an accomplishment.
Right.
But things weren't perfect. I was broke down 6 days out of the first 14 that I was on the road. I ran out of money on day 3. Okay, so the gas stations that we had lined up to donate gas and hotels that we had lined up to donate the hotel rooms, that was gone after the first day because we were no longer on schedule.
Oh, wow.
So the kind of things that I would run into over and over again, it had to be a mantra of, I'm still breathing, so I'm still going. I'm still breathing, so I'm still going. Motorcycle's broken? Well, let's figure something out. Let's make a phone call. Let's do this. Let's figure out whatever we have to do. Let's go talk to people who's in a position to offer a little help. And speaking of that, I'm going to be doing a book signing in Savannah, Georgia, May 11th, however far that is into the future. So I'm going to go down to Savannah, Georgia and sign books for people. But I'm going to go down there because I broke down there too. And when I was broke down there, it was Friday afternoon, and I was due in Jacksonville, Florida on Friday afternoon, so I wasn't there. And I walked in, and I had about $200 left in all of my personal bank account and the foundation's bank accounts. And I walked in, and they said, it's going to cost you $1,900 to fix your motorcycle. And the manager was standing right there next to me. When the service manager told me that news, the general manager was standing right next to me. She pushed me aside and went to the service managers and said, do it. We're covering everything.
Wow.
So just the generosity of people to help me make sure that I could get this mission done was stronger than my desire to quit.
Let me ask you this, and I have to ask this because we are a Christian program, and I am openly and unashamedly a believer in Jesus Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit to act in ways that we don't anticipate. Did you ever think that maybe there was an unseen hand that was helping you along the way during the ride?
Totally. And I wrote about it in the book. There was one of my favorite paragraphs in the book says something to the effect of, I was alone for a long time and I was able to talk to God in complete sentences. I didn't know I wrote that till I went back to reread it or proofread it when I was done. That's a pretty good line. God is mentioned more than once. I grew up Christian myself, went to Catholic schools in junior high and high school. I carried a lot of that belief with me, and a lot of that belief just took me to the next. It just made me put one more foot in front of the other.
Mm-hmm. We've got people who are listening around the world. I know that this program, compared to some of the other programs that are broadcast, especially cable, whatever, but even as far as internet webcast, this is a relatively modest offering. I do this because I enjoy doing it, and because I think the topics that we cover here on A View from the Bunker are important. But just so you know, Tony, we've got a note here in the chat room at Spreaker.com from Malaysia. Got a listener in Malaysia who writes, kudos to Tony Price and the Gold Star Ride Foundation. American heroes and their families deserve better. And again, his point being that you are honoring them in ways that they should be honored by the American people at large and our government especially. Also a question from a listener who wants to know whether you ride through the Midwest. How do they find out, or is there a schedule of when you might be riding through the Midwest so they may be able to coordinate? Is there a place where people can find you on the web to find out more about what the Gold Star Ride Foundation is doing?
Everything should be at goldstarride.org. So that's the easy answer to that question. I will also say that we're still working on the calendar part of there's going to be one page dedicated just to a calendar and a schedule of events and things like talking on this podcast or doing a book signing in Savannah, like I mentioned. All of those things will be mentioned on the calendar. As far as our schedule for riding to visit families and inviting people to come along, anybody can ride with us if you got 2 or 3 wheels. We don't charge anything for the ride. We do ask you to sign a waiver before we start. But you can join us anytime we stop for gas or lunch or a hotel, whatever you want. You start when you want, stop when you want, when it works for you, because you know your schedule better than we do. And all of that stuff is going to be put on the website and on the calendar on the website. And we do not seek the families that we go visit. We don't make any phone calls. There's no cold calling where we just call them up and say, hey, your favorite family member was killed and we want to come and say hi. We don't do that. Yeah. There's too much respect for the families and their privacy. And in fact, I visited more than 60 families last year. It might even be more than 70 families last year. And most of them said, oh, you're writing a book? Please leave me out. And I said, okay, no problem. We're not going to. Sometimes I wrote about them, and then I would send that chapter to the family and say, here's what I wrote about you. How do you feel about it? Some of them said, that looks fantastic. I think it's wonderful what you're doing. Put it in the book. And some of them wrote back and said, nah, leave my story out. I'd just rather you didn't. And I didn't have to honor that. I chose to honor that. I mean, as a writer, somebody who's written books, you could pretty much write whatever you feel like you want to write because you're the writer. And they were my experiences too. But I have too much respect for these families that made that kind of an ultimate sacrifice for the rest of us to be able to do whatever we want to do. So I don't have a problem honoring their privacy like that. So they contact us, and then we work out the schedule and figure, okay, we got somebody in North Carolina, we got somebody in Kentucky, we got somebody in Missouri. As a matter of fact, we do have somebody in Missouri. I got the email from them on Friday, a couple days ago. So we are planning to go to Missouri to visit that family again this year. And if I had it my way, we would hit 48 continuous states. As a matter of fact, I'd even try to get up to Alaska if I could. I can't go to Hawaii until Trump builds that bridge.
That's true. And that'll happen when we ban airplanes to save the planet. So,
yeah, we can come up with all kinds of ridiculousness for that.
The book, Yours Very Sincerely and Respectfully, what story in there impacted you the most and why?
That's a tough question because all of the entire story is what impacted me the most. In fact, the first story I told you about how I got started, that's probably the one that impacted me the most because it changed my life. It changed all of the decisions I made after that. The stories in the book, we've got the 12-year-old I mentioned from Pennsylvania, and that was not the one with the 3 fire trucks, by the way. So there's a couple families in Pennsylvania. Hearing about the girl living in her backseat of her car in Florida was powerful. The families that I met everywhere. One of the stories that impacted me greatly in Phoenix, Arizona, was the widow. Her husband was killed. She was in her mid-40s, and she was telling the story to me of we're just sitting and talking. We just visited for about 90 minutes, and she's sitting and talking. And at one point, she just said, every day I would drive home from work, white-knuckled, just squeezing my steering wheel as I turned down the street that I lived on, knowing that if I saw a strange car on my street parked in front of my house, I knew I had bad news. So every day, and her husband, he was one of these guys who didn't have to go. He was in his 40s. He was in the reserves, and he volunteered. And he went over to Iraq for a year, and he came back home for a month, and he said, I can't stay here. My guys are still there. I have to go back and lead my guys to make sure they stay safe. And he came back after the second year, spent a month with his wife, and then he volunteered a third time to go back a third time. And it was halfway through that third hitch that she actually didn't drive down her street to find a strange car. They called her at work and said, come home now. There's a strange car waiting for you here.
Oh, wow.
But for 3 years, she explained to me that was her day. The worst moment of her day was driving home from work to see if there was a strange car on her street. That story impacted me. I'll never forget that. As long as I live, I'll never forget that.
You mentioned visiting a woman whose son had been killed in Vietnam over 50 years ago. So there are no time limits. There's no statute of limitations as to when somebody calls.
And we made a conscious choice. I sat down with the board of directors and we were talking about that. And they said, the topic came up, and I said, there's so many organizations now, veterans organizations, that draw the line at 9/11. 9/11 seems to be this magic timeline place where they're not supporting any veterans prior to that. And we all know what happened on 9/11, right?
Sure.
And I personally have experience with that. I've called up veterans organizations that say they help disabled vets. I'm a disabled vet. And the first thing they ask me is, when did you serve? I said, well, I got my honorable discharge in 1991. And they said, well, sorry, we don't go any older than 9/11. And that just set so sour with me. I thought it seemed so hypocritical. How can you choose which veteran you're going to support? I mean, so we made it a choice, and it was a discussion between me and the other board members about that. And we just said, not only are we not going to put a timeline, we're going to let everybody know that there's no timeline.
So what percentage of the families that you visit have lost somebody who served prior to 9/11?
Oh, I don't know if we have a percentage that we can actually quote. We don't keep those kind of statistics. We just go, if there's a family that calls, we just go. We just go. And I think I've already mentioned that I've got a special place in my heart for the Vietnam vets anyway.
Sure.
So whenever it's possible. See, Vietnam seems to be one of those things that it's become a single paragraph in the history books, in the high school history books. Nobody wants to talk about Vietnam. They just say, no. You talk to any politician, what are you doing about the guys that are still in Vietnam? Because, not everybody got to come home. And they just say, well, no, we're not talking about that today. They just kind of trying to get rid of it like it didn't happen. And we still have people walking among us. I have personal friends who served in Vietnam, and I think that is an incredible insult to them, that we're trying to forget what happened. Listen, we made a bunch of mistakes. We shouldn't have been there in the first place, but we were. What happened. And the idea that we're trying to pretend it didn't is an insult to those people who went there and served courageously and bravely.
Yeah, indeed. I was a little young for that era. I remember some of what was going on, some of the protests. As a kid growing up in Chicago, couldn't miss what happened in '68 at the Democratic National Convention there. Right. But my wife is old enough that she knew friends that she went to school with, grew up with, who went off to Vietnam. That's right smack in her age group, and it impacts you in ways. Even as the people who just knew the people who went off, you're right. The American public would today just sort of like to forget, sweep that aspect of our history under the rug. So it's good to know that not everybody is holding to that line. So thank you for doing that. What are some of the services, some of the things that you've been called upon to do? Again, Gold Star rides sort of suggest to people who've never heard of your organization before that's the main thing. It's sort of an honor ride thing. But what other things you've mentioned a couple already? But what are some of the other services or projects that you'll take on to help those who've been left behind?
Well, it's difficult to answer that because not all of the requests have come in yet. We whatever is needed by a family is something that we're willing to try to figure out how to do it. I'm fortunate that in my 5.5 decades of being a human being, I've picked up a lot of experience in a lot of different areas, counseling being only one tiny bit of that. So I've got a lot of different things that I can call on for resources to help them with whatever they need. We have counselors that I can call on. I can refer them to other counselors. I can do a little bit myself. If they have a housing issue, we'll step in and figure out how to do that. I've got 20 years experience managing real estate as well. So whatever they have a need for, all they have to do is present it to us. As long as, they're not asking for something ridiculous. Like if somebody calls up and says, I would really like to have a gold-plated Escalade. Can you fix me up? We're probably going to say, well, what do you drive? If you're not driving anything now, we might see if we can find you an old Pinto. Of course, I'm just saying that for comedy's sake because it's pretty hard to find a Pinto anymore.
That's true. And that's a good thing. Yeah.
We'll help them get transportation. We're not going to get them a gold-plated Escalade, but we'll just help them with whatever they need. I remember the 12-year-old that we met in Pennsylvania. When I got there, I started in Minneapolis, rode around the Great Lakes, into upstate New York, and then down into Pennsylvania and the other New England states. But when we got there, it was somewhere like 2,600 miles into the journey. That's, how many miles I had already put on the motorcycle when I got there. And this 12-year-old, all he really wanted to do was sit on the motorcycle, and he wanted to say, he repeated this. I bet I heard him repeat it 10 times in the hour that we spent together. I can't believe you rode this thing 2,600 miles to see me. And then I get an email from his mother 3 weeks later, and she says, I can't thank you enough for coming over here and coming to see my son again. It's all he's been able to talk about for 3 weeks. He just talks about that guy who showed up out of nowhere, that stranger who showed up and rode his motorcycle 2,600 miles to get there. So sometimes that's all it is. That's all they want, is for some stranger to show up and say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to forget the sacrifice that you made. Your government might, your neighbors might, but I'm not going to. And sometimes that's all they need. Sometimes that's all they want.
How can people help? What needs do people have that where outside assistance might help the Gold Star Ride Foundation serve them better? What can people do to help the Gold Star Ride Foundation?
Well, it never hurts my feelings to hear that people are praying for us. So that everybody can just stop what you're doing for 30 seconds a day. On your way to the kitchen, on your way to raid the refrigerator, just stop, stand still, say a prayer for 30 seconds that says something like, keep your eye on the Gold Star Ride Foundation. So that's always a great place to start. We also live in a world where pretty much anything we need, we can get with money. So donations to our organization are all tax deductible, I must say. We're all tax deductible. We're an official 501c3 organization. But when we get donations, we can do an awful lot of work. And the more donations we get, the more work that we can get done. And for what it's worth, I am a volunteer. I wrote the book as a volunteer. I don't get paid anything for the book. The publisher has agreed to not take any profits from the sale of the book.
Wow.
Everything goes to the organization.
And, of course, the website is goldstarride.org, goldstarride.org, and it will be a link in the show notes at vftb.net where you can follow that link. Also a link to the book at amazon.com. Is that the best place to get a copy of yours, very sincerely and respectfully, your book?
Well, the best place to get it is from our website, because then it'll come across my desk and I'll autograph it to whoever wants me to autograph the book. They are available in the Kindle edition and the paperback edition from Amazon. And I must have done something right, because so far Amazon says I got 4.5 out of 5 stars as feedback on the book.
Yeah.
So, that's pretty cool. But yeah, the best place, our offices have the hardcovers, the paperbacks, and the ebook edition. So you can get all three of those. And we're working on the audio book right now too.
Yeah.
So that'll be soon, but it's not yet. And, just real quick, allow me to explain the title. The title is Yours Very Sincerely and Respectfully. When we visit the families that we visit, we present them with a plaque, so they have something they can hold on to that says that we were there. And this plaque has engraved in it a letter that Abraham Lincoln wrote. And he wrote it to a woman named Bixby. So it's referred to as the Bixby letter. It's relatively famous among the writings of Abraham Lincoln. And he wrote the letter to a woman who had lost 5 sons in battle in the Civil War. So that was his motivation for writing that letter. So it's a 3-paragraph letter. We took the first paragraph off because it just talks about the woman who lost 5 sons. And then he says 2 paragraphs about how sorry he is about it and how grateful the nation is. And he signs that letter, Yours very sincerely and respectfully, Abraham Lincoln. So that's what is presented on the plaque that we present to any family that we visit.
That's, the title's unique enough. I should have thought to ask that question. So I'm glad you included that story here before we closed. I will also say to listeners, if you're interested in a copy of the book, knowing from personal experience, if you purchase directly from Tony's website, goldstarride.org, more of the proceeds will make its way to the organization because Amazon won't be taking its cut. So in addition to getting his signature inside the book, which would be, I think, an honor, you're also helping out the organization more than going directly through or then going through Amazon.com to pick up the book. One final question, Tony. What do you hope people take away from reading the book? Yours very sincerely and respectfully.
I kind of hope that people will get to the last page and they put it down, and I just want them to say, wow. It's kind of a selfish thing to say, I suppose. But I want them to take away from that, okay, I haven't been doing enough for Gold Star families in my life, so I'm going to start being more aware of Gold Star families and our military and what our military does, and a little bit of respect from our military. And if I could just take a caveat off of that, I think that as a society, we're dangerously close to the phrase, thanks for your service, becoming cliche. I have heard a lot of people say it to me, and it takes an extra second, just 1 second, to put a pause in there to make it sound more sincere. And that's all you really got to do. I don't ever say thank you for your service without doing a two-handed handshake to the person that I'm talking to. That's just me, unless there's some physical barrier that's stopping it from taking place. But I will always reach out to shake his hand, and when we're shaking hands, I'll grab his hand with my other hand, or her hand, whoever it happens to be. But just the idea, thank you for your service, should be a little bit more than a cliche. A
ritual, something you do because it's expected.
Right.
Yeah.
We want it to be something that you do because you mean it.
Yeah. Well, good advice. I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, Tony, and find out a little bit more about your organization and what you're doing. Tony Price is the executive.
Thank you very much for having me.
No, my honor, sir. And I'm glad you reached out, and I pray that your travels are safe. And again, Tony will be in Savannah, Georgia in just 2 weeks. That's May 11th, so it's just coming up very quick. So if you're in the Southeast, just keep an eye on the website, goldstarride.org, to find out when and where Tony will be there to sign a copy of the book. Yours, very sincerely and respectfully, the true story of the Gold Star Ride Foundation's 2018 journey across, around, and through America, honoring Gold Star families. Tony, again, my honor to have you on today, and appreciate your time tonight and your work.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up, we're going to talk a little bit about how Orwell's vision is becoming a reality. Yes, it's 35 years after 1984, but we are definitely in that world that he foresaw. And we will get to that story about the Oxford professor who believes that human-alien hybrids will save us from ourselves. Our final segment coming up straight ahead on A View from the Bunker.
Millions of people from around the globe were stunned when U.S. President Donald Trump shocked the world by recognizing Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel and ordering the American embassy to be moved there.
The United States finally and officially recognized Jerusalem as the true capital of Israel and opened our embassy in the historic and sacred land of Jerusalem.
Over 2,000 years have elapsed since Jesus Christ warned of a day when a man of sin, the Antichrist, would appear to lead the world into deception and destruction.
Even Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu admits that biblical prophecies are unfolding, that Donald Trump is a King Cyrus-like figure leading the world into a new era of man.
President Trump, by recognizing history, you have made history. The Temple Mount is in our hands.
Violent protests continued in the Middle East today over President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital.
And now the official Sanhedrin in Israel declare President Trump is advancing a prophetic process that will usher in, when the time comes, the rebuilding of the Third Temple.
As the world awaits, a secret, incendiary scheme is underway by religious authorities, government agents, and Jewish rabbis to build a third temple.
When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in that holy place, then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be again.
Rabbis, Donald Trump, and the top secret plan to build the third temple.
Shall we begin?
Let's begin now.
Your weekly dose of reality. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Next weekend, we talk about the giants of old, the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Ryan Pitterson, author of Judgment of the Nephilim, joins us. He will be one of the featured speakers at the Unsealed Scroll Prophecy Conference in early October. We'll tell you more about that in just a minute. Had the opportunity to meet him at the Hear the Watchman Conference in Dallas recently, and he'll be joining us in San Antonio in October. So again, that is next Sunday night, May 5th, 2019. Ryan Pitterson, author Judgment of the Nephilim, our guest here on A View from the Bunker. We have moved into the world that Orwell foresaw. We now live in an age when the technology has caught up to to the world of Big Brother that George Orwell wrote about, 70 years ago now, just about? I mean, we're 35 years past 1984, but we are certainly now living in that world. And we're accepting it because we see it as necessary to the convenience and entertainment that we're demanding from our mobile devices, from our smartphones, tablets, televisions. But now it's even moving into the grocery store. We're moving into the Minority Report? Was it Majority Report? I forget the Steven Spielberg film with Tom Cruise. Anyway, when we go out shopping, we can now be what's the word? Anyway, the geo-fenced, where there are electronic areas that are boundaries that are set up around certain areas and can send targeted messages to people moving into that area. In fact, this was something going on even 7-8 years ago. Our daughter started getting texts from stores at an outlet mall that we visited one weekend. But it's going a step further. If you remember that scene in the Tom Cruise film where he walks into a mall and suddenly he's getting targeted ads directed at him and addressing him personally, we're getting close to that because stores are now beginning to install cameras that are trying to guess your age, gender, and mood to target ads to you as you enter stores. So imagine, you're going into a supermarket and you look at a certain store or a certain product on the shelf, rather, and apparently the algorithm, the AI behind the camera, can tell whether you're looking at something and expressing some interest. And then suddenly flash an advertisement on a display near the product display. Cameras are trying to figure out what it is you're buying, what kind of mood you're in when you buy it, and then use that information to target ads specifically to you. This is the world into which we're moving. We are giving up information 24/7, sometimes not even realizing that we're giving up that information. A story came out this week about Amazon's Alexa devices. The Amazon Echoes and Echo Dots. Look, I had an Android phone, and I used to use the voice assistant there to record memos when I was doing outside sales. I'd record thoughts about the conversation I just had about the buyer before I got too far away, so I could remember what I had to type up in my report when I got home. But since then, we've switched over to Apple's electronic universe, and I don't have Siri turned on any of my Apple devices. I don't know for a fact that Siri isn't listening, however. And all of these devices have cameras built in on both sides of the device. Now, I've got friends who will put electrical tape over these cameras. I haven't done it yet because, frankly, I use my camera in my phone and my iPad for work occasionally, especially when we go to Israel in May. The iPad's going to do a lot of heavy lifting. I mean, it shoots 4K video, and it's easier to carry than a than a GoPro, and it's more versatile than a GoPro. But it also means at the same time that those cameras may be recording things without my knowledge. And geotagging pictures, geotagging apps when they're open so that somewhere somebody can analyze what I'm doing, when I'm doing it, perhaps even what I look like or what I'm saying when I'm doing these things. It was revealed this week that people who use Alexa's voice commands, which, by the way, are not just in Amazon's Alexa or Amazon Echo devices anymore. If you've got a Fire Stick, which is Amazon's version of Roku, a set-top box, if you're using an Amazon Fire Stick, you can activate Alexa in that. And now you've got manufacturers like Toshiba and Insignia that are making Fire TV-ready televisions with Alexa included. You've seen the television ads, I'm sure, about how convenient it is to just say, Alexa, order chocolate chip cookies. And suddenly it'll place an order with Amazon and send the products out. Convenient, great. But apparently Amazon has employees working in other parts of the world, like India and Romania, trying to decode what Amazon's Alexa devices are recording. Because not all of us speak clearly, some of us, and we speak with different accents, and so they need to make sure that the voice to text or the AI or the algorithm that's trying to decipher the voice commands is doing so accurately. But it's become known that these conversations, these recordings, are sometimes picking up things that users didn't intend, like very personal and private moments, sometimes illegal activity, and sometimes things that you just as soon rather not have people hear, like singing in the shower or whatever. And some of the people in these remote data centers in Romania and India and elsewhere are sharing those audio clips around and commenting on them. And apparently, when they record these devices or have access to these sound clips that they analyze, they can also access data about the user, like where you live, your home address, which is tied to your Amazon account. This is really getting intrusive, and I don't think most users really recognize this. And again, I say this as somebody who's got so many internet-connected devices, even around me right now. So, I'm preaching to the choir here because I use the internet to communicate. And so I've got these devices that are pinging the internet almost all the time. But, boy, one thing we don't do is turn on the voice assistants, the Siri or Google's Assistant or Alexa, because, I don't know, maybe it's just the illusion of a little more privacy. Maybe I'm conning myself into believing that these devices aren't listening. But boy, if you've got those Amazon Echo or Echo Dot, or you've activated Alexa on your Fire TV, that thing is listening to you all the time. And the people on the other end of the device know exactly where you live. So just think about that. You've basically got listening devices tied to your address with people on the other end, only God knows where, who may be listening in and sharing some of these things that the microphones are picking up. Should have seen this coming. In fact, the first novel that I wrote, The God Conspiracy, maybe that was the second novel. Yeah, it was the second novel I wrote, that was about 13 years ago. So back in 2006, when I wrote about this, I was already aware then from the research that I did for the novel that the only way you can deactivate completely The microphone in your mobile phone is to turn it off and take out the battery. I mean, turning it off isn't enough. Law enforcement can still activate and listen into your phone, even if it is powered down. And if you've got an iPhone like I do, iPhone 7, you cannot take out the battery because you just can't open the case. So good luck with that. Anyway, yes, we have moved into 1984. And, speaking of creepy, by the way, Amazon is taking this even a step further because in their warehouses where they actually pack and ship the orders that we place with Amazon, they've got their warehouses under surveillance and a system that tracks productivity, worker productivity, to the point that the AI, the algorithm that analyzes worker productivity, can generate the paperwork to fire employees without a human making the decision. Let me repeat that. Amazon doesn't just track worker productivity in its warehouse. It has a computerized system that can automatically generate the paperwork to fire employees if they don't meet targets. Welcome our new robot overlords. We are turning our lives over to algorithms. But this is the way of the future. So many of us are connected to Facebook as a matter of... In fact, many of us addicted to social media, Facebook, Snapchat, Insta, or whatever. In fact, a group at Oxford, and we'll get to that Oxford professor here in just a minute here in A View from the Bunker. The Oxford Internet Institute predicts that within 50 years, the dead will outnumber the living on Facebook. I mean, think about that, because we set up a profile, set up some pages. I try not to get political on Facebook anymore, but I have to use Facebook just to, again, let people know what we're doing at SkyWatchTV, let people know what we're doing here on this program. And so I log on to Facebook on a regular basis. I'm not even sure how many pages Sharon and I manage on Facebook anymore. But there will come a day, I'm 57, statistically speaking, within the next 20 years or so, I hope for longer, but, just being realistic, where I will go to my eternal reward. And what happens to all of my Facebook profiles? The Facebook profile and the pages that I've set up, they don't disappear when people die. And over the next 50 years, people who've set up Facebook pages and profiles who pass on will leave them behind. And according to this group at Oxford, by the time we reach the year 2070, there will be more dead profiles on Facebook than living profiles on Facebook, which is kind of a creepy thought when you think about it. Especially Sharon and I were contemplating this. In fact, this may even work its way into the book that the two of us are working on together, working title Profiling the Dead, because it's about the veneration of the dead, which we can document. It probably goes back much farther than this, but we can document it for sure going back 4,000 years to the time of Abraham. Because we know the Amorites of the ancient Near East, the lands that today we call Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, etc. The Amorites who controlled that culture about 4,000 years ago had a religious system that included regularly monthly rituals of summoning dead ancestors to a ritual meal, because it was believed in that culture that remembering the dead and calling them by name was required to continue their existence. Their continued existence depended on the living remembering them and summoning them by name every month and setting out a ritual meal. There was more to it than that, but that was the reason that they did it. One's continued existence in the afterlife depended on being remembered. Isn't it weird now that we're living in an age where, in that mindset, that worldview, people will never die because they'll always have a Facebook profile? Isn't that weird? We'll probably explore the implication that the last couple of years, it suggests replies for you. This is part of an artificial intelligence the AI research that Google has been doing. In fact, there's a novel that Sharon and I read a couple of years ago by the author William Hertling, Hertling. Would like to interview him sometime, actually, called Avogadro Corp. And it's very thinly disguised as to who he's referring to. He comes from the tech industry, so he's got some insight into how all of this works. Avogadro, by the way, if you're trying to figure out who he's referring to, it's like Google. It's actually a type of very large number. So it's a mathematical reference. So that's who he means. And the program is based on what happens when an AI developed to answer email for people, or at least suggest ways to improve email communication, goes rogue. Interesting stuff. Anyway, Google sent out a note this past week from their Global Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which, speaking of Orwell, it is like the title that most legislation in Congress gets. This job description actually describes the opposite of what Google is all about. The Global Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, who is now also apparently the head of what's called employee engagement or something. Yeah, employee engagement. And I'll just be brief about this, but in a nutshell, and this has been publicly posted, by the way, at one of Google's blogs, very proudly proclaiming how they have simplified and clarified the way employees can raise concerns about other employees by bringing multiple channels together on a new dedicated site. We just published internally our investigations report, the 5th annual summary of employee-related misconduct investigations, including discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. Well, remember last week we talked about how Google employees raised a fuss because their new Artificial Intelligence Advisory Board included a conservative, the president of the Heritage Foundation, to the point where Google just said, the heck with it, we're going to disband this AI advisory board because it's not worth the hassle. It's like 1984. Anyone guilty of bad think must be subjected to the 2 minutes of hate. And the person responsible for putting this out is the Global Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. This is truly a disturbing universe. Well, one final note, and again, the reason I brought this up is because the headlines make it sound like an Oxford professor is convinced that an alien-human hybrid species will save the Earth. You have to read a couple of paragraphs in to discover that Dr. Young-Hae Chi, who has made this proclamation, actually teaches Korean language at Oxford. So let's just say that astrophysics and astrobiology are not his areas of expertise. But Dr. Chi has said that he believes that we are already hosting bug-like aliens, and that these bug-like aliens are interbreeding with humans to create a new hybrid species that could one day save Earth from our self-inflicted disasters like climate change. According to Dr. Chi, the visitors are not altruistic. They are meddling in Earth affairs because they share a comprehensive biosphere with humans. And so they're actually looking out for their own survival, but they may, as a byproduct of preserving their own lives, actually save humanity. This is the reason, or at least an example of one of the reasons, that Josh Peck and I wrote the book, The Day the Earth Stands Still. Because belief in an ET savior is, frankly, a science fiction-based religion. It is religion. And there is no evidence to suggest that Dr. Chi has... Well, there is no evidence for his theories. And yet there are many people who will point to him, and people like him Well, he's an Oxford professor, so he must know. Well, he's an Oxford professor of Korean language. That does not make him an expert on astrobiology or exotheology, for that matter, which is really what he's describing here. But if you do a little digging into the modern UFO phenomenon, you will find out very quickly that it is really exactly that. It is exotheology. It is a new religion, and it is based on occult beliefs that go back at least 3,000 years. So, The Day the Earth Stands Still, Josh Peck and me, you can find it at the SkyWatch TV store, skywatchtvstore.com. I'm not saying that because we want to sell more books, but because it's important. When you look at surveys of what people believe, there are more adult Americans who believe that we're being visited by extraterrestrials than believe in the God of the Bible. It is a new religion. So that's why we get out and talk. And we got a number of places that we will be talking this year. SkyWatch TV's first annual Defender Conference, August 2nd through 4th. That's at the Radisson Hotel in Branson. That is sold out, of course, but we're just about a week away from opening up orders for streaming video. So for more information on that, just keep your eyes on the website, defenderconference.com. We've got a countdown calendar there. Orders for streaming video begin on May 6th. Dr. Michael Heiser, Pastor Carl Gallups, Dr. Michael Lake, Joel Richardson, Sharon, me, Josh Peck, and more. Again, defenderconference.com for information on when streaming video becomes available because, again, that conference sold out very, very quickly. A couple of weeks after that, Sons of God, Giants of Old conference. Sharon and I will be in Lubbock, Texas for that conference. Dr. Judd Burton putting it on again this year, and honored to have both Sharon and me speaking. Pastor Dan Cressman. There will be other speakers. We will announce those as we learn about those, but keep your eyes here for more information about that. That's at the Fellowship, the church pastored by Pastor Dan Cressman in Lubbock, Texas. Sons of God, Giants of Old conference, August 16th through the 18th of 2019. The True Legends Conference addresses the alien question this year. Speaking of UFOs and our space brothers, that'll be at the Mansion Theater in Branson, Missouri, September 13th through the 15th. L.A. Marzulli, Steve Quayle, Timothy Alberino, noted ufologists Richard Dolan, Chase Kletsky, George Knapp, Gary Stearman of Prophecy Watchers, will be revealing some information that he's kept to himself for many years. And I know that Gary has a story that he can tell about missing time as an avid pilot, something that it's really creepy when you show up at an airfield long before you should have got there, or long after you should have got there, should have run out of fuel. So more information on that at gen6.com, GENSIX.com, the True Legends Conference, September 13th through 15th, and I'm honored to serve as the Master of Ceremonies for that again this year. The Unsealed Scroll Prophecy Conference, October 4th through 6th. That's in San Antonio at the Grand Hyatt on the Riverwalk. Sharon and I honored to be featured speakers along with Pastor Carl Gallups, Rabbi Jonathan Kahn, L.A. Marzulli, Bill Salas, Ryan Pitterson, next week's guest here on A View from the Bunker. He'll be there as well. Jim Barfield of the Copper Scroll Project, Paul McGuire, Pastor Billy Crone, and music by John Schlitt, formerly of the legendary Christian rock group Petra. That is going to be fantastic. UnsealedScroll.org for that conference. UnsealedScroll.org. And if you use the promo code Gilbert20, that's Gilbert20, you'll get 20% off registration. And we'll be in California the weekend after that, October 11th through the 13th of 2019. That's the Hear the Watchman Conference at Hilton Irvine, Orange County Airport. L.A. Marzulli, Russ Dizdar, Messianic Rabbi Zev Parat, Pastor Paul Begley, our colleague from SkyWatch TV, Josh Peck, will be there. Stephen Bankars is co-author on Second Coming of the New Age. Gans Shimura, Troy Anderson, Paul McGuire, Michael Boldea, and more. For information on that conference, log on to hearthewatchmen.com. That's hearthewatchmen.com. And, oh, by the way, we're already planning our Israel tour for 2020. May 11th through 25th of 2020. For information, lipkintours.com. That's Lipkin, lipkintours.com. Hey, give us a review. You can find us at iTunes, the iTunes podcast store, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are sold. You can give us a like at Facebook, our Facebook page, View from the Bunker, which is a production of Gilbert House and released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Our opening theme is Iron Bacon by Kevin MacLeod. His website is www.incompetech.com. SkyWatchTV.com. Our announcer is DC Good. Next week, Ryan Pitterson, author of Judgment of the Nephilim, as we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.